to faces.
Hi everyone, my name is Staci Ross and I'm the Cataloging and Metadata Librarian.
Hi, I'm Brenda Salem and I am the Hispanic Languages Catalog Librarian.
All right, so our talk today is on collaborative communication. So that means we will be communicating. There's going to be a couple of polls throughout the presentation. So just be prepared for that. It should pop up on your screen. If for some reason you have a problem with it, just send a message in the chat and we'll try to get it to work for you. Let's get started.
Okay, before we dive into documentation at Pitt, I'd like to talk about why document management matters in general. Marion T. Reed, writing about libraries on the whole, said, "A healthy library organization has a set of documents which describe where it is, where it wants to go, its objective, and how it plans to get there, its goals. This can also be applied to documentation in general, where policies and procedures are part of the day-to-day how we get to where we want to go." LIS research suggests that many libraries lack formal knowledge management processes, and that there is a need for libraries to plan and implement knowledge management strategies. Literature on academic libraries in particular suggests that continuous retention of institutional knowledge remains a serious problem. In addition, libraries face continuous changes and uncertainties, which reveal the need to address institutional knowledge management in increasingly efficient and sophisticated ways. Next slide, please. Technical services in particular are highly process-driven and can be more susceptible to the disadvantages of change and uncertainty. Research has also shown technical service departments have issues with communicating their functions and policies to outward-facing departments. Next slide, please. Document management allows us to plan for uncertainties and look to the future. Uncertainties may include staff changes and attrition, having to do more with less, and changes in library services, resources, and technology. Looking to the present and future, document management can unify departmental actions and decisions, communicate local practice within and outside an organization, and contribute to knowledge within the profession. It also gives a sense of responsibility and professionalism. Next slide, please. Let's dive into a few changes common to library organizations. These may include staff attrition through retirements or even onboarding new employees. Keeping established staff up to date on new skills or tools, or rare situations like special projects, are also situations made easier through good documentation. It also gives opportunity for not as social individuals to learn about their department or institution, especially if institutional knowledge is typically conferred by word of mouth. Libraries are also constantly changing technologically. LMS or ILS migrations are increasingly common and require synthesizing large amounts of information. Institutions also regularly reorient their strategic and institutional goals, and practice must be in alignment with that. Idiosyncrasies of local practice reveal the need for established staff to keep abreast of day-to-day practice, while also maintaining a historical record of past and current practices for future referral. This can be especially helpful in light of technological and service changes. Next slide, please. So well-managed documentation can mitigate the loss of an organization's knowledge and reduce the common phenomenon of knowledge being stored in people's heads. The Delphi Group, Inc. in 2000 identified 4 components of organizational knowledge: employee's brain, which garnered a whopping 42% of responses, paper documentation at 22%, electronic documentation at 20%, and electronic knowledge base at 12%. Before we get at how we try to even out these components, we're going to first discuss the situation at the ULS's Technical Services Department. Next slide, please. But first, we're going to do our first poll. Let me see. About documentation trends in academic libraries. And I'm going to give you guys about 30 seconds to answer what documentation styles or platforms you've used in your departments or institutions, and select all that apply. Oh no, it only lets you select one. Apologies for that. Well, let's try to pick the one that is most common at your institution then. Apologies for that.
Yay, so much participation. You guys are the best.
Yeah. I'll give it 10 more seconds. And thank you, Amber, for pointing that out. Apologies for that. All right, so I'm going to close the poll. And LibGuides received 40% of responses, which isn't very surprising since that's a pretty common platform that academic libraries in particular use. Office software and word of mouth actually tied at 20%. Paper documents or files at 15%, and a few 5% of respondents, or one respondent, said wikis were a common documentation platform at their institution, which is very interesting. We're going to talk more about that, in particular wikis and kind of how we try to get things more on paper and less by word of mouth. Oh, sorry about that. All right.
Okay. All right. Okay. So now I'm going to give some background on our department. The Technical Services Department is where the acquisitions, cataloging, and end processing functions occur for the entire university library system at the University of Pittsburgh, which is also known as the ULS. The department consists of 26 full-time employees across 4 units. There are 9 librarians and 17 paraprofessionals. Over the years, there has been a slew of retirements of longtime staff, and more recently, onboarding of new librarians in supervisory roles. Next slide. Before we get into what we have been doing recently to maintain our departmental documentation, I want to give an overview of how our online documentation maintenance has evolved. As we talk about the different styles and platforms we used, think about what some of the drawbacks and weaknesses of these methods would have had. Okay. Next slide. All right. One of the earliest attempts at departmental documentation was the Latin American Cataloging Links webpage. It was created through the personal initiative of one of the catalogers in the Latin American cataloging team that catalogs Spanish, Portuguese, and indigenous languages materials. The webpage, which was hosted in the cataloger's personal university-affiliated website, was just a list of links to resources on the web that could be used to help in cataloging materials from Latin America. I managed to get a screenshot of the webpage, which I include here, so you have an idea of what it looked like. The screenshot only shows a small part of the total contents that existed on this webpage. The links were organized into several sections, which ranged from very general informational resources to more specific cataloging-related resources and resources specific to Latin American countries. This webpage was shared only with the Latin American cataloging team, which at the time was 3 of us. After the cataloger who created the page left the organization, the head of cataloging decided that the page should be shared with the entire catalog management unit. So the page was revised to include a combination of local cataloging procedure documents and links to web-based cataloging resources, such as Cataloger's Desktop. The page was then transferred to the behind-the-scenes intranet of web pages that served as a place to store and access documentation and procedures for the entire ULS. Next slide. Thanks. As you can see, this revised web page was categorized by the format of the material to be cataloged. Once the web page was revised, the rest of the catalog management unit was informed of the availability of the new web page and were encouraged to contact the person who maintained the page, which was me, if they knew of any updates or changes to the procedures that needed to be made. When there were changes that needed to be made, I would then proceed to make the changes to the HTML code or update any documents via FTP. When the ULS adopted SharePoint to store the behind-the-scenes organizational information or documentation, all the documentation and links from the Catalog Management Unit Procedures page were moved to a new SharePoint site. Unfortunately, I don't have a screenshot of our earliest SharePoint site, but apart from the documentation and links, it also, we added resources for RDA training. And now, take it over to Gabi.
Eventually, the head of technical services became interested in revising the site to have documentation for the entire department. So with her support, a small group of staff from different parts of the department were recruited to help gather feedback on what should be included on the site and how it should be organized. We also enlisted the help of our IT department to help with setting up the page and assigning reading and editing permissions. We approached the heads of the functional areas within the department for any updates to local procedures, and the result was this SharePoint site. The main components were general information about technical services department, local procedures, and special project procedures. Also included were links to cataloging resources and a discussion board. This was essentially a prettier version of a static library of online files. It was different from the previous site in that the goal was to contain documentation for all of tech services, not just cataloging. And also these documents were stored on the site itself instead of linking to other resources. Unfortunately, the setup didn't account for version control or making on-the-fly edits. The site also had a very limited search functionality, which resulted in inefficient document retrieval unless you knew the exact title of the document you were searching for. Anything written was produced by individuals and then handed off to a single staff member, which, as you can see, was Brenda, who would handle uploading them to the site.
Okay, now it's time for our second poll. There we go. Oh. So what we want to know is, what do you look for in documentation? Select all that apply, but if you can only choose one, just choose one. Give you about 30 seconds. Yeah, we probably would have been a good idea. All of the above. All right, I'll give you a few more seconds and okay, I'm gonna end the polling. Okay, so it looks like the biggest by far is the reason what you look for is the ease of use with 52%. With the second most popular answer was shared open access at 29%, followed by the ability to track changes, which is, and then tied for fourth place is fits with institutions' software capabilities and manageable maintenance schedule. So yes, we will talk about all those. Now, I want to stop sharing results. Okay. Let me see. Ready. All right. So now we're going to talk about what can go wrong with document management and why often a particular method fails to serve the needs of the department. We have just gone over our early versions of online document maintenance, but now we want to talk about why they did not work out well as a reliable way to maintain documentation for cataloging and technical services. Next slide. Okay, first, let's start with the Latin American cataloging links page. The cataloger who created it is an excellent cataloger who had great intentions when she created it. I also liked how the resources focused on the intellectual side of original cataloging, such as information necessary to create authority records and assign subject headings. But it was not a stable, reliable form of documentation. To begin with, it was stored on a personal website. When the cataloger left, she was responsible enough to pass the information on to our head of cataloging, but if she had left unexpectedly or on short notice, it could have become a problem and resulted in a complete loss of documentation. Also, a web page was not easy to update and required a knowledge of HTML and FTP, which not everyone has. In addition, information was siloed to a small group within the department when it could have been useful to the entire department. And finally, there was an over-reliance on web links, but not enough local procedures and policy. As our document maintenance has evolved, we've realized that including publicly available web links is not the best use of our efforts to maintain departmental documentation, because links change and stop working fairly frequently, and making sure the links are up to date require too much time and effort. Moreover, links to outside resources are easily found via a search engine. There are a few exceptions to this, which I will mention later. The catalog management unit, in turn, the procedures page for the catalog management unit addressed the issues of a precarious location and a lack of local documentation. However, some issues still remained, including the ease of updating and the siloing of the information within the catalog management unit. Next slide. Okay. By the time we got to the first version of the technical services SharePoint site, we had moved our documentation to a central location that was accessible to all of technical services. We had greatly reduced the number of external links and focused more on local documentation. However, many problems still remained. The technical services SharePoint site was essentially a static library of individual files that did not allow for version control or a simple way of making minor edits. To make an edit, you had to download the file, make the changes, and then upload it to SharePoint again. SharePoint also had a limited search functionality, resulting in inefficient document retrieval. Under this system, procedural documents were produced either by the policymaker or under the guidance of the policymaker, while a single staff member was charged with uploading them to the site. This meant that the person who created the procedure and the document had to, 1, still be employed at Pitt, 2, recognize a need for an update to the document, 3, commit to physically updating the document, 4, email the document to the person in charge of updating the site. And then the person who updated the site still had to locate the old document and replace it accordingly. So the more obstacles between beginning and finishing a task meant that it was less likely that the task would be completed. Keeping documentation up to date required a more involved process than simply asking a single individual to upload files and then having the individual wait to be notified of changes or updates to procedures by the respective owners. Moreover, making any changes to a document required the owner of a procedure to provide a replacement file to the person who updated the site, but sometimes that person was lucky to be even told in person or by email what changes to make in the current document. I'll hand it over to Gabi.
All right, so as we've definitely mentioned, the SharePoint site had a difficult end user interface. It had this super limited search functionality, and if you didn't know the exact type of document you were looking for, it was going to take a lot of fishing to find it. Adding to the difficulty was that a lot of the procedures in technical services deal with the same type of key, so bib records, exporting, orders, things like that. This is an issue because it led to duplications or conflicting procedures, since it often wasn't recognized if there was an older version that had already been created and was available. So if someone was looking for instructions on how to export a record, they might find 2 or 3 documents on it with varying instructions. So say you want to avoid the dreaded search function and just use site navigation to find the document instead. That avenue was also somewhat complicated, unfortunately. All the procedures were put into broad categories. And while this was an excellent way to know where to start, going into one of those categories only resulted in a slightly smaller mess of every procedure we had. It became pretty apparent that it would take less time to just ask a couple of coworkers what they did and go with the overall consensus instead of checking with the document in practice. Getting the documents to exist in the first place also wasn't easy. Basically, the individual had to recognize that maybe what they're doing should be written down. And then they had to actually put in the time and effort to write it down and then forward it to the staff person in charge of uploading it to the site. Thank you, Brenda. And the person who created the documents were the only ones that were really held accountable for updating it. And oftentimes they were the only ones that realized it had been created in the first place. Those who weren't involved weren't encouraged to participate or offer corrections or even knew how to contribute if they wanted to. Since documents were hard to find and even more rarely reviewed for accuracy, those who wrote them could easily see it as a pointless task that didn't really help anyone. After all, if someone just needed to know the information, you could just ask them, right? There is also a problem with non-transparent communication, or worse, no communication at all. When newer updated procedures were added, the department wasn't always notified. Procedures were often written with little formatting or organization, which can make them difficult for others to understand if they weren't already familiar with what it was describing. And of course, as we've mentioned, there is the inconsistent storage and updating of the documents to deal with as well.
All right, it is time for our third poll. Let's see. Ooh, hold on. Let's see. Hold on, just give me a second here. Okay. Much polling. Okay. So, what we want to know, let's see, what we want to know is what is the main reason documentation matters? Please select one option.
Be really good at that because we've been practicing selecting one option this entire time. All right, we got about 10 seconds left. This is the last poll, so if you want to participate, now is your time.
All right then. Okay, let's hear the results. Looks like the most popular answer was retains institutional knowledge even when staff are no longer employed at the institution. The second most, at 29%, unifies actions and decisions of the department. And I guess, let's see, the third, the third place goes to provides guidance to established and new employees. And finally, at 10%, communicate policy to units outside the department. Right. So
Now that we've seen reasons why document management fails, we can start to understand our needs for an open, collaborative documentation and communication system. Based on our experiences and LIS literature, we found 4 factors for knowledge management and facilitating departmental communication in academic libraries. In general, it involves shared documentation, shared access, shared ownership, and version control. For Pitt's ULS Tech Services, shared documentation has meant a centralized shared repository of documents and updates. As an institution with long-term staff, we perceive this as the best way to increase the amount of knowledge stored in people's brains, or outside of people's brains, excuse me. Shared access has meant the ability to access documents and news from different locations and the ability to collaborate and communicate across departments to help foster internal and external communication. In order to encourage buy-in, it was also important for the system to be easy to use for as many users as possible. Shared ownership has meant multiple stakeholders taking ownership of this new system. On our end, this included making sure to facilitate user participation and investment in the new system. Version control, or the ability to keep track of changes, was especially important so the new system was responsive to inevitable changes. Next slide, please. In addition, we found that we had other needs outside of the scope of the aforementioned on the previous slide. Documents from previous systems were not necessarily easily transferred or updated. Some were in PDF form, for instance. So we had to decide on maintenance and archiving for legacy documentation. Another big issue with previous attempts at documentation were the platforms used. They required a great deal of work to maintain and update, and in some cases were difficult to navigate. So when we were thinking about changing things, our available platforms included Microsoft SharePoint and SpringShare LibGuides. The former already housed our documentation, but required an interface with a lower learning curve. While there are some internal pages, Pitt LibGuides were generally used for public-facing documentation, and except for in technical services where we actually didn't have much experience with LibGuides. Our feasibility review found that the wiki feature in SharePoint would meet our basic needs for shared documentation, access, ownership, and version control. The planning process took longer than initially anticipated. We spent almost half a year of planning and preparation before the initial stages of implementation. We developed flowcharts for reorganizing documentation into functional areas and for establishing a workflow for reviewing legacy documentation and maintaining new documents. Another hurdle was getting buy-in from everyone in tech services. This involved numerous iterations of emails for soliciting feedback on documents for review. Rather than being sent to the units which developed the documents, we decided to send them to all of technical services. This revealed unexpected stakeholders, cross-unit discrepancies, and needs for further clarification in policies and procedures. Next slide, please.
All right. Now we will share some examples of how documentation became important at the University of Pittsburgh library system. In March of this year, the importance of documentation became very apparent when academic institutions across the country and the world closed down due to the COVID-19 pandemic. On very short notice, technical services staff found themselves working from home with very limited access to their work computers, wondering, what do I do now? Which I'm sure many of you have found yourself in that similar situation. Luckily for us, we already had the Technical Services SharePoint Wiki serving as a remotely accessible space for documentation. So all we had to do was quickly create technical services documentation that was specific to working from home and was not already available in the wiki. Within several days, the Remote Work Procedures Wiki was created. And next slide, you will see what it looks like. Okay, so in order to avoid duplication of documentation between tech services and the ULS IT department, the wiki page includes instructions only for installing software specific to tech services. A link to the ULS IT SharePoint page is included for instructions related to software that is not limited by department, such as Voyager and OCLC connection. It also includes instructions on setting up software preferences stored in Office computers. This is when exceptions were made to excluding web links from our documentation. For example, we included a proxy-enabled link to RDA Toolkit, as well as including a link to our Voyager web admin site that was used by non-IT staff for Voc and Vorts. Being able to create this wiki page made evident that having an established online space for technical services documentation was instrumental in making critical information needed to work from home quickly accessible in case of an unexpected event such as the one we have experienced. It also showed that communication with other departments is important in avoiding duplication of documentation and avoiding confusion. And if we need to make any updates, we don't need to access separate documents. All right, handing it over to Gabi.
So back to the wiki in general. The resource is also used for outward-facing communication with colleagues. So on our wiki, we have something called the Liaison List. And what that list does is provides the name and contact information for the librarian and acquisition specialist responsible for each of the 6 areas of study at Pitt. As part of this documentation update project, the list was reviewed for potential errors. What we discovered was that due to multiple retirements, there was a collection of areas of studies that had no liaison or acquisition specialist assigned. When we looked into it further, we figured out that the reassignment had actually occurred at an informal level. The person leaving had basically emailed someone else and tagged them in instead. No notice was given to those outside of the individuals involved, and it was never put into written form. So this list is actually really important for those of us outside of the acquisitions unit so that we can know who to contact for inquiries into materials from various areas. As librarians, faculty can sometimes ask us about getting books for their section because they know us and they know that we work in the library. And obviously it doesn't matter that that's outside of our specific role. The list allows us to refer them to the proper representative quickly and in turn help grow the relationship between the faculty and the library. The wiki is also really useful for helping to onboard new staff who are outside of the department, but who work closely with the department. An example of this is when we hired a new preservation coordinator. There had been a rather lengthy gap between hires, and the supervisor for the position was brought on after the previous coordinator had left. So that meant that the entire unit, which was the 2 people, was made of completely new employees that had no interactions with the previous members or practices. Although there was some documentation left behind for them, there was nothing that clearly outlined how the interactions between technical services and preservation had previously been taking place. When it became apparent that the preservation department was unaware of what tasks the unit had previously been responsible for us, such as keeping the flare stocked or the workflow for requesting repairs, we were able to simply print off the relevant procedures from the wiki and hand them off to the coordinator. She then took our procedures, made the necessary additions to her own manual, and it allowed both units to function smoothly together. So proper documentation is also essential for the consistency of practice. I'll give you another good example of vendor returns. In case anyone doesn't know, a vendor return is what happens when you order books from a vendor and maybe they sent the wrong ones or there's too many, but for whatever reason, you need to send them back. So during our review of documentation for the acquisitions department, it became apparent that there were conflicting procedures on how vendor returns should be handled. When we originally asked for corrections from the entire unit, we were given 2 methods of procedures for preparing the boxes for shipment. One method was from acquisitions, which gave the boxes to a department outside of tech services to handle, and the other was from the catalog management unit, which gave the boxes to another department within tech services to handle. When we asked which one was the current practice, we were told both were. It took some time for us to figure out what we should be doing as a department as a whole, but eventually a decision was made. The decision was then documented, all associated parties were made aware of it, and everything worked out. But this is a really easy example of how even if people are working physically close to each other and are responsible for the exact same task, there can still be a breakdown in communication.
Another example of how documentation helped unify practice was in our former copy cataloging procedures. Copy cataloging formerly occurred in 2 units, which each had different procedures and cataloging standards. After the heads of these units retired, copy cataloging continued under 2 increasingly different standards without a check or unification of the policies and procedures. This resulted in records of varying quality and vastly different cataloging practices, which became especially obvious when cataloging legacy special collections. One particular collection had an unusual retention policy, which was only known in one of the units responsible for cataloging those resources. Collection name wording and additional necessary background on the collection was also lacking from general procedures. During our regularly scheduled documentation review, we discovered these inconsistencies and were able to remediate them. Open, easily accessible documentation led to consistency of practice in copy cataloging. Next slide, please.
Okay. So why is an open communication structure necessary? For one, it is a good way to keep an entire department informed when otherwise not everyone would have had the same access to departmental knowledge. Another big reason is our upcoming migration to Alma. With the migration, we will have to follow entirely new workflows and procedures. Having access to institutional knowledge via documentation allows us to understand past and current practices, which greatly helps the Alma implementation team and related working groups in coming up with new workflows and procedures for Alma. With an open communication structure, staff know who to talk to when they have questions. They then become used to sharing their opinion and suggesting changes, since they can be sure who they are supposed to communicate with. And finally, open communication gets institutional knowledge out of staff members' heads and doesn't disappear when the staff member leaves or retires. Next.
There's some easy ways to help increase community engagement, and by that I mean your unit or department for documentation management. The first step is to set up a foundation of consistent communication. Make sure that some form of communication regarding documentation or unit updates is being presented on a regular but not open basis. Request feedback and opinions in an open manner. This will help build clear channels and methods for everyone to go to when looking to share information. This step can take some time and effort to get off the ground, but as people see it in action, it'll become more natural. This leads to the second step, which is to acknowledge all communication in a timely fashion. Everyone here has most likely experienced taking the time and effort to give feedback or information and then never hear a response regarding it. This can be frustrating and can make the person less likely to want to contribute in the future. Whenever a suggestion, question, or concern is presented, it's important for those in charge of it, at the very least, to thank the person for their contribution. Not every input will be a game changer, but the individual has taken the steps to help the unit grow, and that effort should be recognized. The third step is to ensure that there is a sense of respect for each other and the communication offered. Remember that everyone's opinions and feelings are valid, even if their suggestions are not what's decided upon in the long run. Another way to help grow a sense of open communication is to send your communication to the entire department, not just the policy creators. This is a fantastic way to discover if different areas have practices that impact other areas. As an example, if you recall the vendor record updates we talked about before, we originally thought it was strictly an acquisitions activity and later found out there are catalogers involved as well. Sending documentation updates and update requests to the entire department also lets everyone know the responsibilities and roles of each other. This allows for better facilitation of goals and actions throughout the department. And of course, anytime there's a consistent grouping of people in a shared task, there's the potential to create a sense of team. Our final suggestion for increasing community engagement in your documentation management activities is to make sure you have the support of supervisors or management. Creating and reviewing output does take time, and the support of supervisors allows for that resource to be used. The support of management can also help lend a sense of legitimacy and importance to the documentation initiative, which may give individuals more motivation to take part.
Okay, so now that we've talked about how we fostered a communication of, a culture of open communication, let's wrap it up and summarize what we've talked about so far. We talked about why document management and communication matters in general, and flowed into why it matters for the Technical Services Department at Pitt in particular. We saw the evolution of our previous attempts at document management and addressed why they didn't work for our current needs. This led us to discover general needs for open, collaborative documentation systems and particular needs at Pitt. Then we talked about why document management succeeds and how this has helped improve our local day-to-day practice and planning for our future. Finally, we left you all with insights on why open communication matters and tips on increasing community or departmental engagement. Next slide, please.
All right, so now we are open to questions and comments, and feel free to type them in the chat window.
If you don't have any questions, we'd love to hear some things that other people have been doing to help with their documentation or to help increase communication between their units, especially now when a lot of people's workflows have changed. I'm sure a lot of people are working remotely. Have you found things that have worked? Have you found things that don't work? I think it would benefit everyone. stop moving.
Want to take the first one, Gabi?
Do we consider communicating with the resource sharing department as well? Yes. Once we get our stuff cleaned up, we'd love to have it interacting more with the other departments, especially with our migration. A lot of workflows are changing between all of the departments. So I think it'll be a really helpful step.
Yeah, some of our future plans involve kind of having another layer of documentation that is outward facing to other departments within the ULS. And that includes ILL and resource sharing. Thank you for your question. Do you share the SharePoint site and updates out through institutional newsletters? Not currently.
That is definitely
That's a good idea, though.
a good idea. Yeah, right now, I mean, with the Alma implementation, we do have our own they do have their own SharePoint site, and there's this constant, updating and sharing of, letting people know that the SharePoint site is there for more information. So it's something that can definitely be done.
Yeah, especially once we start building up more on the outward facing stuff, that would be a really great tool to use.
And I guess I didn't mention, we do have a weekly update that comes out every Friday. So that's the newsletter that we have.
So Kelly, hi Kelly, has said that they recently started using Teams but relied on Box for a lot of documentation. And it sounds like we might not have a Box subscription at some point in the future. Yeah, so I've heard of some people using Teams. It's been kind of mixed, at least with the colleagues that I've talked to about it. Some people really like it. Some people groan every time they turn on their computer and they see the update saying, try to use Teams. I think it's really finding the best fit for the people that you're working with and making sure that it is accessible to everyone and has a way to access from various networks. I think is an important part. Kimberly said she started a Box folder with all of their internal procedures. That's always good. Lots of backup.
Yeah.
The thing about Box is that you can collaborate on documents. Yeah, that if people can be working, 2 people at a time can be working on a single document.
Right. And we have, Amber responded again, and she said she would highly recommend sending the updates. People don't always think to come to their site, so they share it everywhere they can, and they can bring it up in faculty meetings wherever they can. That's fantastic. I think the more communication you have and the more avenues you have, the more success you'll have. So that's fantastic, Amber. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah. That's a lot of good ideas for us.
So there's another question from Dee Borrell. What was the single thing that made documentation a major focus? For me, I'm the newest person in tech services. And when I arrived, there were a slew of retirements. And I was at a loss as to what was going on, what to do. And it turns out that I wasn't the only one when I started asking around. I think that's a big thing that made us focus on documentation and kind of wrangling it and getting it on a shareable, more open system. Right, you guys?
Oh, well, I think from one of the things that also made it a focus is the Alma migration. As I mentioned previously, or I mentioned in the presentation, we were sort of re-examining all our current practices, and we were thinking, well, why did they choose that? Why is it this way? And there was, and a lot of, and is exactly like, a lot of the people that would know the answer to that were gone. They had retired long ago. So, and it also opened up where, we started looking at other departments. Well, what do they do? So it really definitely opened up. It made it, apparent that we really need to maintain documentation and, share it openly with other departments.
For me, it was when Staci started and I felt bad and I tried to hand her all of my notes and it was just a file folder of chaos. And I was like, everything's in there somewhere. I'm so sorry.
And our what we do isn't limited to just cataloging or metadata or whatever role we have. A lot of it it's kind of like this hydra that reaches out to other aspects of technical services. So our work is so interconnected, but we know so little about the procedures and how to keep everything consistent in technical services. That I think consistency was a real issue for me at first, because different people did different things, and really a unified practice was really important.
Kimberly had asked how to get past the SharePoint training because it can be rather complicated. And Claire shared that public services highlighted a knowledge base in SharePoint, and the learning curve is very steep. They moved the content into SpringShare's FAQs for an internal knowledge base, and it's much easier to use, but buy-in is crucial to success. Getting potential retirees to document is, again, about buy-in. For libraries, it's surprising this is a widespread issue. Yeah, it is a steep learning curve. I definitely did it the brutal way, which was look at other people's SharePoint sites and then Google how to do the part that they did. A lot of clicking and being both embarrassed and thankful for version control so I could just undo what I did. That was part of the reason with the planning process taking half a year, was us just figuring out what it was capable of doing and how to do those things. So there is a lot of stuff online for how to use it. Some people have made YouTube videos. You can ask another librarian is always a thing. And it's worth the effort, because once you get it up and running, then it's just repeating with new information.
Yeah,
so it's really worth the steep curve.
Yeah, I definitely learned through trial and error over the years. It's a kind of a difficult thing to wade through, and one of the advantages of having a wiki is that it's a bit easier, because they're pages as opposed to documents, and I feel like navigation is easier as well. So I think that was a good thing about the wiki.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have a lot of people sharing about how they do their documentation. Emily says they have an electronic copy on their shared network drive as well as a print copy. It's very helpful as they lose staff members through retirements and have to take on new duties. Yeah, I agree. It's the retirement thing, because once someone's ready to retire, the last thing they want to do is write down everything they've done for the last 40 years.
Yeah.
We did get some buy-in to it. We had 2 people retire very close to when we had first launched the wiki. And one of the ways we got them excited to do it, it was like half a guilt trip of like, this will really help the people that you're leaving your work to. And it was half legacy, where like, just you'll write down what you did, your name will be on it, they'll see that you made this, and all of your hard work that you've done isn't going to get completely destroyed by someone just trying to figure it out. So it has multiple benefits, but it can definitely be complicated. And if you've fostered that sense of communication and community before the person retires, then they've already created the documentation and they can just retire in ease and not have to worry about it. So it's definitely one of those things you want to keep running as much as you can.
I like your comment, Amber. I like to say elected to space, as in, if I get elected to go to space, I want my team to be able to pick up exactly where I left off. I like that.
Brilliant. All right. Unless there is anything else, I think we all agree that it needs to be done, it seems like, and everyone has their own method of doing it. And that's great. Do what works for you guys. Just make sure it happens is the main thing. We are librarians. We're supposed to collect and organize and disseminate information, and that should count for us too. So
making it as easy as possible helps.
So yeah, we all just want to say thank you for attending and for all of your participation today. These are email addresses. Obviously, we are totally open to hear from you. We would love to hear from you. If you have any questions or comments or follow-up, feel free to email us. And these slides will be available at some point, I believe, after the conference is over. So of course we have our works cited. As good librarians, we must, but we also have some further readings in case you want to get a little bit more deep into documentation and SharePoint and specifically communication and technical services. So that's everything I have for now. So
thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for presenting. The next session will start at 11. This session was recorded and it'll be